My wife and I had been trying to be pregnant for the greatest part of the last 10 years. We had a few terrible moments of hope that always ended up in blood and tears before the diagnostic finally fell. My wife's uterus couldn't carry to term, and if it did, it would be a miracle. They said something about an abnormal uterus shape and how she would always be at risk for a second trimester miscarriage, and that while she could, with the miracle of medicine, give birth naturally, it wouldn't be without sacrifice. Said sacrifice was 9 months in bed, in the hospital starting the second trimester, so she could be under constant supervision. Considering that the cost of a normal pregnancy was already expensive, this was beyond our means. We were devastated. This was when we considered adoption. Unfortunately, we didn't know that adoption was a journey as long as pregnancy, with as many disappointments on the road. We tried foreign adoption. It was too expensive. It was also a very tedious process that involved hours and hours of judicial lingo we didn't have the energy to learn. You can only have so much patience and motivation when you're hanging on by a thread. We'd suffered too many losses and too many hardships to go down that road. We thought about making our house a foster house, but here again, there were financial complications. Our house was modest and could easily house up to 3 kids, but my wife would have to quit her job, and we'd have to do plenty of modifications to our house structure to accommodate the government's legislation concerning foster houses. And all in all, whatever we were thinking about didn't seem to align with us. Especially when it came to financial means, we weren't dirt poor, but an average family can't afford to adopt or to foster with an average wage without putting themselves in debt. We wanted a baby or 2, of course, but not at all cost. We took the time to discuss it, and decided to gather enough money to adopt. I took a second job, and my wife asked for more hours as well. We worked our butts off for another 2 years and managed to scrape what we needed. And that's when the fire happened. We lost our house. We had to fight with the insurance just so that we would be able to afford another house, but smaller. And with the debt we'd just been stacked with, there was no way we could adopt. I felt like I lost my wife too. She seemed lifeless, completely exhausted by life. I couldn't blame her either. The new house was far from her family, and in a neighborhood that didn't have that great of a reputation. There wasn't gunshots every other night. It wasn't that bad, but our next-door neighbor was on the sex offender watch list, and the couple that lived across the street called the police 3 times a week for domestic violence. It wasn't awful, but it wasn't good either. Until one night, a miracle happened. I came back from work, tired and just grumpy as hell as usual. The flashing blue and red lights were parked in front of my lawn again, and I couldn't even be asked to listen to the woman snarling at her man for the umpteenth time this month. I closed the door behind me and sighed so heavily I felt like my soul just escaped through my mouth. And then I smelled the spaghetti sauce and saw my wife in the living room, watching a kids show and humming. In context, this was a heavenly sight. I hadn't had the pleasure of eating my wife's food in a very long time, what with her being depressed and all. I would have never forced her to cook or do anything under these circumstances. I loved her too much to be that kind of man. So, smelling the spaghetti was both extremely unusual and very pleasing. I loosened my tie as I entered the living room so I could kiss my wife. When I finally faced her, I realized why she was this happy. She was holding a baby. Fresh out of the oven, or so it looked like, if you know what I mean. I found it, she told me, and you could understand how wildly surprised I was. And before I could say anything, she pointed at the living room's table, where an envelope was sitting, waiting for me to read its contents. I wanted to ask what she meant by "she found it." But seeing her with a bottle of milk humming to the child made me rethink about ruining the moment. She looked happy, and it was the first time in many years that I saw her smile. So I opened the envelope and I pulled the letter out, only to read a 4-letter sentence. "You've waited long enough." That's all. This didn't answer any question. I was disappointed now because I had no other choice than to ruin the moment. "Katie, what do you mean by 'you found it'?" She replied that she heard the baby screaming through the door as she was throwing away last night's garbage. Someone had deposited the baby on our doorstep with this envelope and left. Katie called it a miracle, and my heart tightened because I knew what I was about to say would break her heart. I asked her if she realized what it meant. She didn't even look at me. It was like she was completely fascinated by the little angel sleep drinking in her arms. I asked a little louder, and she shot me a glare I swore was murderous at the moment, then calmed down and said it was her miracle, that finally something good was happening, and that I could just go with it. How hard was that? She wasn't thinking straight. Otherwise, she would hear herself speak and think about how crazy that sounded. I had to raise my voice to tell her that we couldn't keep a baby that wasn't ours, that this baby belonged to someone else, and that the parents were probably worried sick to know the whereabouts of their child. The baby started screaming. My heart melted a little. But I still knew it was wrong. We couldn't keep it. My wife spoke again, but only to hiss at me that the baby had been left here for a reason. And it broke my heart to see her so defensive and so irrational. I knew she was taking it hard, but I didn't think it was that bad. I should have listened to her more. I carefully approached her and pressed my palm to the cheek with a soft smile. "Honey, it's not ours. How are we going to explain it? We have to find the real parents. Imagine if it was ours and it just disappeared." I saw her expression crack a little. Then she looked down at the crying baby. She pulled the bottle from the little boy's lips, and he reopened his eyes. I'd never seen eyes so blue in my entire life. Bluer than the sea, bluer than the sky above. Blue like eternal ice. So blue it sent a shiver down my spine. There was something in that baby's gaze, too, something far more intelligent than any baby had any right to have. And he kept staring at me. Not at the hand that fed him, but me. A man who was trying to tear him away from his new family. And I don't know why, but I felt scared. I was even terrified. Maybe my wife felt it because within a second she was climbing the stairs and slammed the door to our guest room, and I stood there basking in my confusion for a couple of minutes before I decided to sit down and make a list of pros and cons for my wife. I also heard the spaghetti sauce bubble, so I went to the kitchen and turned off the stove. I boiled the water, prepared the pasta, all while thinking about what I should do about my wife and that baby. If I called the police, she would never forgive me. If I didn't do anything, I was an accomplice to kidnapping. And neither of these options sat right with me. I needed my wife to realize how irrational she was being. Once the pasta was ready, I prepared a bowl for my wife and climbed the stairs. With a gentle knock on the guest room door, I invited her to dinner with me. She didn't speak to me, and that night I went to bed alone. When I awoke the next morning, I walked over to the guest room. The door was still locked. I called Katie through the door, but she didn't reply. I could hear her humming to the child, though. I had to go to work, so I told her I loved her and that we needed to talk tonight. Tonight, if she didn't come to her senses, I was going to call the police. She was leaving me no choice. The day passed, and I couldn't wait for it to be over. When I arrived home, I sensed that something was off. I immediately climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. I couldn't hear her humming, only weak little moans and the giggling of a baby. It took me a few tries to break the door. Sweat was covering my forehead by the time I had entered, and what I found instigated a fear within me the likes of which I'd never felt before. My wife was laying on the bed, pale as a ghost and thinner. It felt like she'd lost 20 pounds overnight. Her breathing was wheezy, labored, and erratic. And when I called her name, her eyes rolled in her orbits and lazily stared back at me. With what little strength she seemed to have, she pulled the baby closer, who, in retrospect, looked puffy, pink, and soft like all babies. It was even giggling like it had no care in the world. But of course it didn't. It was a fucking baby. Was my wife sick? I rushed to her side, but when I tried to grab her hand, she growled weakly and tried to push my hand away. I was flabbergasted, and so I reached in my pocket for my cell phone and quickly dialed 911 when I felt her weight crashing into me. I was stunned because she was a lot lighter than usual, but also by how ferociously she was now attacking me. Katie was clawing at my wrists to get me to let go of the phone, and I did. I could hear the operator on the other end of the line asking me what the urgency and how she could help me, but I was trying to fight back my wife without hurting her. I could feel her nails tearing at the skin of my arms. I could hear myself asking her to stop, begging her to recognize me, to tell me what's happening. I could hear her words forming in my mind, escaping through my mouth, but left without answers. My wife started punching. She leaned down to bite me. She had gone feral. I finally managed to roll over her, and she kicked and kneed at me with every bit of energy she had. I heard that childish laughter in the background as I slammed her wrist to the ground next to her head and asked her what the hell was wrong with her. She had no answer. Instead, she snapped at me with her teeth and tried to free herself through relentless squirming. I couldn't let her go. My wrists were bleeding heavily. I heard the giggle again and turned my head to look at the baby. And that's when my wife took the opportunity to roll on her side a little, just enough that her lips and teeth would latch onto my wrist. The scream that escaped me was inhuman as her teeth pierced through my flesh, bit through muscles and bones alike, and the sound of her ripping into me like that had me gagging. The hands supported by that wrist lost all strength, and I started bleeding profusely. Over her beautiful face, the floor, everything. She managed to free her hand and clawed at my face and my chest with her free hand, and I fell onto her, and she bit me in the crook of my neck, once more tearing a piece of me. The pain I was in was beyond what I'd ever felt. My whole body felt trapped as I rolled on the side, and she climbed onto me and started punching me. She might have been light, but after 2 chunks of me had been torn, I wasn't that strong either. She scratched my face, and I felt a sharp pain in my left eye. I screamed again and used my only good hand to punch her in the stomach. And that fucking baby was laughing louder and louder. My vision was blurring as I tried to stand up and run out of the room, and I managed to run into the hallway before she slammed into me while howling like a beast. Now, I knocked my head pretty hard against the wooden floor. My ears rang. I felt her claw at my back, tearing through my clothes and skin alike, and all I could do was try to crawl away, with her still sitting on my ass and using my back as a scratchboard. There was blood dripping down the side of my face, my mangled wrist, and the gash on my neck. Everything felt warm, cold, sticky, and disgusting, and I was in a tremendous amount of pain. I called her name, and she punched me in the back of the head, forcing my head to meet the floor once again. I finally reached the stairs where I just allowed myself and her to fall unceremoniously. I managed to get her off my back, but I couldn't stand. My body felt heavy and I was too tired. And I heard the sirens in the distance, and my wife screamed as she stood up, She started kicking me, and I think I lost consciousness somewhere after the 5th or 6th kick. When I woke up, it's the smell of antiseptics that reached to me first. Only one of my eyes opened and the other couldn't. I saw a woman with red hair and thin rectangular glasses scribbling something on a notepad, and I asked for some water. She smiled softly at me, brought the glass to my lips and let me drink. She told me to sleep some more and that she and the police would explain everything once I woke up again. Might have been hours when I woke up again. I listened carefully to the police officer telling me how they arrested my wife when they found me, how I was safe. The doctor even told me that I would possibly retrieve more than 70% of my motor function in my wrists, but probably not all. I asked about the baby and tried to explain that our problem started when the baby appeared. But the policeman stared down at me in confusion. What baby?